It is my great pleasure to introduce Michael Milken, my good friend, whom I met in 1970, 50 years ago, when we were both students at the University of Pennsylvania. I was in the medical school and Michael was at Wharton. And we bonded at that time through a shared interest in helping people. Michael's interest was motivated by extensive firsthand experience with death, disability, and suffering as it affected many immediate family members. In parallel with his investment banking career, Michael pursued philanthropy as a means to accelerate progress against disease. And in 1982, he created the Michael Milken Family Foundations. Things changed dramatically in 1993 when he was diagnosed with cancer. It instilled in him a new sense of urgency, and his philanthropic interests were catapulted to a new level. He realized that writing checks was not enough, and he called me to brainstorm for some ideas as to how to create a new type of research organization that would work faster to cure disease, that would bypass the federal government bureaucracy, foster collaboration and stimulate innovation, and would recruit the best and brightest minds and provide a higher return on philanthropic investments. Over the years, I've known many highly successful individuals, but Michael is in a league of his own. He's been the driving force in a multitude of initiatives that have had an incredible impact on society. Some include the Milken Institute, the Prostate Cancer Foundation, Faster Cures, the Center for Advancing the American Dream, and several years ago, he and his wife endowed the Milken Institute of Public Health at George Washington University. No one person has done more to disrupt and enhance the medical research paradigm. He was recognized by Fortune magazine by being placed on its cover with the tagline, "The Man Who Changed Medicine." Over the years, he has bet big on new technologies, often with spectacular results, and that's the basis for his enthusiasm in focused ultrasound. Of all of his accomplishments, the greatest is that he has astonishingly been married to the same woman, Laurie, for 52 years, and he met Laurie 62 years ago. They've produced 3 children, which have resulted in 10 vectors for his DNA. Michael, let's hear from you.
Thank you, Neil, and I cherish our 50-year friendship, thrust for many purposes, but one of them is medical, healthcare, and medical instrumentation. So I'm sorry I can't be with you in person today. I was looking forward to joining you at the 7th Focus Ultrasound Symposium, and hopefully next year at the 8th, I'll have a chance to join you in person. You couldn't have gone to an event that I hosted over the last almost 50 years, whether it's a Milken Institute, our medical foundations, businesses, without me reminding you of the greatest achievement of mankind, which is the extension of life. 4 million years of evolution resulted in only an 11-year increase in average life expectancy by 1900. Today, 120 years later, life expectancy on the planet has gone from 31 to approximately 73. And that is the cause, if you step back and think about it, from the developments in technology, medicines, healthcare, sanitation, public health, etc., that have driven 50% of all economic growth over the past 200 years, whereas each human life is priceless. In making arguments on allocation of government resources or other resources, quite often you have to bring up the economic argument and point out to people that 50% of all economic growth in the last 200 years can be traced to advances in healthcare. Bob Fogel, Nobel Prize winner from the University of Chicago and good friend, put out a slide a number of years ago showing the dramatic changes and developments that occurred. It's hard today even to think back that in 1900 in America, the three major causes of death were tuberculosis, dysentery, and pneumonia. All three would not be high today due to developments, not the least of which was penicillin. So as we think about these innovations and think about bioscience and medical instrumentation, it is far more than your health. It is food, agriculture, water, environment that we live in, energy, protection against pandemics, and protection, unfortunately, against bioterrorism. And those countries that are the leaders in bioscience and medical instrumentation will be the leading countries in the 21st century. We often say that you had a plan and life gets in its way. My original plan was to run the space program in the United States. And after Sputnik went up in 1957, I wrote a letter to President Eisenhower, letting him know I was ready to run this program, even though I was only 11 years of age. Unfortunately, I never had a response, but I chose to go to Berkeley to pursue science and mathematics. In 1965, when I was home during the summer, the Watts riots occurred. It was the beginning of the ramping up of the Vietnam War, but you didn't have to go to Vietnam to see armed personnel carriers on the streets. They were on the streets of Los Angeles, and I met a young African-American man who told me he would not have access to capital nor his father because of his race. It was hard for me to believe because I had believed in the American dream, which was you could achieve whatever you were capable of achieving, regardless of race or man or woman or religion or where you were born. So I went back to Berkeley and changed my major to finance and began to study credit. And I wrote down this formula that essentially prosperity required access to financial capital, different kinds of financial instruments, which served as a multiplier effect on human capital, social capital, the two main assets in the world, and a multiplier effect on physical capital that you normally find on a balance sheet. This idea that most of the assets were social capital or human capital was not a new idea. Gary Becker won a Nobel Prize in 1992 for this idea. And as we look at what's occurred around the world as financial markets opened up in the last 30 years or so of the 20th century, you can see enormous job creation and opportunity in new industries, new technologies for small and medium business. And those with the ability and the new ideas who could now get access to capital changed the world, and larger companies had a hard time competing. Around the world, this varies depending on what country you are, but in the U.S., with the most developed capital markets, you saw small and medium companies create 62 million jobs in the private sector, while large companies created -4. It is the search for worldwide capital that defines the 21st century, and that is the talent of individuals. The United States, with its universities, has been a major beneficiary in the last 50 to 60 years, where best and brightest from around the world have come to the United States to go to college, university, graduate school, and often stay. If you look at Silicon Valley alone today, 50% of all the scientists and engineers in Silicon Valley were not born in the United States. But maybe the easiest way to define this is if we look at the industry that changed the world at the beginning of the 20th century, the automobile. Automobile companies were not the most valuable companies in the world at the time. Those companies involved with natural resources were. And most of the value in a car was found in the natural resources that were used to manufacture that car. What changed the world at the end of the 20th century, the microchip, we find less than 2% of the cost of buying a microchip is the raw materials. And the value is the value added by human knowledge, experience, expertise that is added to those assets. Two areas that changed the world. But as the world changed from a natural resource society to a knowledge society, the value went to those that had knowledge. We've always believed in this concept of human capital, and whether it was myself in financing the good fortune thousands of companies or thousands of young scientists, bioscientists with ideas, that made the difference. Now, access to capital is not always available, but there is this venture approach. And if you look at where funding for medical research or medical instrumentation comes from, only 3% comes from foundations or individuals. But that is proved to be the venture capital that started and changed the world, whether it be the beginning of the Focus Ultrasound Foundation or the Prostate Cancer Foundation or the Melanoma Foundation or many other things that have changed the world. It was those philanthropists, foundations, endowments that took the early risk on these different companies. Collaboration. When we tried to identify what were the challenges in healthcare, and so yes, finance was a path that I went on, but life got in the way. My father was diagnosed with melanoma and passed away. My mother-in-law with multiple myeloma. My stepfather with glioblastoma. My sister-in-law passed away from glioblastoma. And our children had challenges in the pediatric neurology area. And when we launched our various medical awards in the late 70s and early 1980s, Neil was front and center in our activities of who we should be focused on. And as we moved and realized that the best investment and the highest return of our philanthropy over a couple decades came from supporting people with new ideas young in their career. Why most Nobel Prize winners win the award when they're 50 or 60 or even 70. Most of those ideas occurred when they were in their 20s or 30s. And so the key was, could we identify them and fund them? The history of growth of collaboration is not new. Benjamin Franklin pointed this out in the mid-1700s when he wrote that if they were separate, they would not survive. But if they combined and worked together, they would. And we used the same analogy 30, 40 years ago as we looked at for-profit, nonprofit, academic centers, government centers, and so on. VA in the United States and other science centers around the world, that we needed to increase collaboration. We needed to share data in order to accelerate science, faster cures. And whether it was the formation almost 30 years ago of CapCure, where CA stood for all cancers, P for prostate, and cure all life-threatening diseases, or whether it was the Cancer March in '98, with 500,000 people in the United States going out, and eventually the NIH budget was doubled, the National Cancer Institute was tripled, the FDA was increased, the CDC was increased, doing an outpouring of support, culminating in the work of 5 years of thousands of people. Once again, this challenge of how do you innovate led us to put on the Innovation Retreat in 2011, which eventually led to the creation of NCATS and the celebration of science. Each of these elements underlining the importance of the investment in medical instrumentation, the investment in technology, and the importance of using the latest technology in healthcare. Not one of the most valuable companies existed as we ramped up our medical research 40 to 50 years ago. Those that believed in 4 areas: cost, speed, data storage cost, and access have proved to be the winners over the past 40 years. If I was sitting at my desk in the 1970s and wanted to talk to one person working for us in India, it cost us $10 a minute. It was hard to outsource at $600 an hour in the mid-1970s. And so today, the cost of telecommunications, and those that believe that the cost was headed to zero, is probably less than 1 cent. Second, speed. Today, as we've gone from 2G to 3G to 4G to 5G, in South Korea, they estimate it takes 1.5 seconds, 1.5 seconds to download a movie. Speed has gone to infinite. Data storage. When we wheeled out, quote, the supercomputer of its day, the IBM 370 in the mid-1970s, data storage cost $1 million a megabit. Today, once again, those that believe data storage cost was going to zero, and you would eventually be able to store all the information the world's created at little to no cost, today a megabit costs far less than 1 cent. Almost a $1 billion reduction in storage costs. And lastly, access. Today, with more than 9 billion mobile phones on the planet, access has become an essential part of our society. As we think about these issues, the formation of faster cures used the analogy of a train. Science was the train. Technology was the train. And theoretically, a train could travel 300 miles an hour. But in the United States, it travels far slower than in most of the other countries in the world. In fact, we discovered it travels at, on average, almost the exact same speed as it did 100 years ago. So it wasn't science, it was the tracks. Legislation, infrastructure, based on another century that slowed down advancements. And so the key to acceleration was trying to find out what we could do to allow science to move forward at a speed that it was capable of moving forward. One of my favorite articles about the human genome, telling us that being able to read 500 letters a day, it would be till 2022 before we sequence the genome. But as you all know today, the cost of sequencing the genome has fallen dramatically and has fallen well below the curve of Moore's law. In addition to that, today, a $5,000 machine can sequence 3 billion pairs in one day, 6 million times what a researcher was able to do in 1993. We also discovered that there's so many things that impede technology, and they always aren't necessarily legislation that existed. One of the most interesting examples would be intuitive surgical. As we looked at minimally invasive surgery that started in more cases in Europe and eventually came to the United States, and the formation of this company with venture capital in the mid-1990s, Intuitive Surgical went public at $6 a share in April of 2001. A few years later, the stock was selling at only 50%. Revenue had not grown, losses had continued. And one of the things we particularly saw at the Prostate Cancer Foundation is many of the people that ran the oncology, urology programs at the leading centers around the world were surgeons. And the question was, how do we know that minimally invasive surgery will have the same results as traditional? Yes, there's far less blood, far less trauma. You're in the hospital for substantially lower part of time. But are the results the same? And so it took really almost a decade for the company to fulfill its mission due to the fact we needed to spend a great deal of time educating people who, in many cases, were about to become obsoleted by minimally invasive surgery who had spent their life as surgeons. I had the honor in 2006 of being able to go to the UAE to cut the ribbon at the Imperial College Diabetes Center in the UAE. This was the most modern testing and treatment center in the world. And because capital was not a scarce resource, they bought every single machine. And this was the first experience I had where a patient was treated totally digital. And so, yes, they bought Siemens and Varians and Philips and GE machines. And in 2012, opened a new center to provide the most modern treatment to their citizens. I remember as a young boy reading about Jules Verne and submarines and trips to the moon at the time. Is quite often the movies reflect the future, particularly in science fiction. So in 1980, there was a movie that came out. Luke had his hand cut off in a battle with Darth Vader. But as it showed, he just got a new hand that was put on that connected. Now, this seems stranger than fiction in 1980. But by 2012, 2013, it became a reality, providing hands to children and adults that had lost their hands or arms, and using 3D printers to adjust the length of the hand so it would connect as the child grew. Let's take a look at that video, and it's hard to believe this was 7 years ago, and today these devices are still being printed by 3D printers, but are far more advanced.
Now pick it up with, yeah, that's right. Clever boy.
The hand that we developed for amniotic band syndrome children and adults is driven by the motion of the wrist. When you bend your wrist forward, it makes the fingers close, and you bring it up, it opens the fingers. With the MakerBot, as he grows, all we do is we scale it up and print him another one, and the hardware just gets taken from that, put onto the new hand, and then we'd like those hands returned so then we can then filter it onto the next person. The MakerBot and being able to swap files up and down via the internet cut our sort of prototyping down from a week down to 20 minutes. It was incredibly fast.
I am actually quite excited of having a rubber hand. I'm excited to try cricket, golf, and go swimming with it. It's amazing.
I can pick up stuff.
I couldn't imagine what it would be like if I had it.
I can throw a ball.
My friends think it's awesome.
I like my rubber hand.
So when I think about intuitive surgical and minimally invasive surgery, it was inevitable that focused ultrasound would have a future. And over the 7 years, there's been enormous growth, whether it be in device manufacturers going to 55, clinical indications, 136, mechanism of action to 60, research sites to more than 600, and treatment centers to more than 500. But when I think of focused ultrasound, it also drives me back to those movies I saw as a young boy. My favorite show growing up in the 1960s was Star Trek. And in a Star Trek movie, Bones, the doctor, was shocked when he went back in time to the United States to see how they were treating people and how they were about to operate on Chekhov. Let's see what the world looked like according to Star Trek.
Who are you? Why aren't you masked? Who are these people?
I don't know.
What the hell is that? What are you doing?
Tearing of the middle meningeal artery.
What's your degree in? Dentistry?
How do you explain slow impulse, low respiratory rate, and coma?
Fundoscopic examination.
Endoscopic examination is unrevealing in these cases.
A simple evacuation of the expanding epidural hematoma will relieve the pressure.
My God, man. Drilling holes in his head's not the answer. The artery must be repaired. Now put away your butcher knives and let me save this patient before it's too late. Dealing with medievalism here. Chemotherapy. Fundoscopic examinations. Come on, Chekhov, wake up. Bob, can you hear me? He's coming around, Jim. Pavel, talk to me. Name, rank.
Chekhov. Pavel. Rank. Admiral.
In 1993, when I was diagnosed with advanced prostate cancer and given 12 to 18 months to live, I also had the same newspaper in New York deliver a message that there was no treatment, therapy, that really appeared to extend life expectancy for prostate cancer. Obviously, we looked at that as a challenge. I'm happy to be with you today, almost 28 years later, and the death rate from projected levels has fallen by 80%, and from actual levels fallen by 50% due to enormous advancements in medical technologies. And the Prostate Cancer Foundation has touched almost every drug that has been approved, more than 12 different therapies that have extended life. Similar, our Melanoma Research Alliance, which is under our Faster Cure Center, has had more than 12 or 13 therapies that are used in melanoma today, as those life expectancies from those with even stage 4 melanoma have dramatically increased. So all of us have benefited from these advances in healthcare, sanitation, medical instrumentation, advances by biotech and pharmaceutical companies. But once again, for all of us, we had a plan, but life got in the way. The COVID-19 pandemic. I was at our medical conference being put on by our medical foundations in Johannesburg. And we met with our young scholars and the leaders, and we had great concern of what was about to happen to the world, particularly in places like sub-Saharan Africa, where the medical care was not available necessarily to everyone on the continent. As I traveled home over that 20-hour period from Johannesburg to Los Angeles, it gave me a great deal of time to think about what strategies we should deploy. We divided our efforts of the 10 centers of the Milken Institute and our medical foundations to focus on their areas of expertise. We divided our work into 6 areas: education, testing, prevention, care, cure, and financial safety nets that needed to be put in place so we would not head to another depression. Everyone has responded in their own way, and we will each be judged, I feel, in the future by what we did during this period of time based on our own level of expertise. One of the decisions we made early was to do podcasts. And I have completed over 100 podcasts. And the purpose of the podcast was when you were talking to leaders, what was their strategy at that time? And instead of myself or even the members of the Milken Institute or medical foundations knowing these strategies, the purpose of the podcast was to make sure everyone had access to this information. The very first podcast was with Francis Collins, head of the NIH. And when you reflect on the first 50 podcasts, half the people were involved in the medical area and half were not. And we focused on all areas, whether it was Alex Gorski. At the time in April when we visited with Alex, he was talking about maybe the J&J vaccine going into human beings in January of 2021. The technologies that J&J had developed in their Janssen Pharmaceuticals subsidiary, they felt they could deploy, making hundreds of millions of vaccines as they dealt with the coronavirus. So the original idea was this would go into human beings in 2021, and this was April of this year. 3 months later, in July, the first humans got this vaccine. And today, the vaccine is finishing in many parts phase 3 clinical trials, and hopefully will be successful in going into individuals. The efforts with the government, funding manufacturing facilities and manufacturing vaccines before you knew if they would work. But what we discovered 50 years ago in trying to accelerate science and bioscience was collaboration was the key. And in my 50 years of working in this area, I have never seen the collaboration that occurred. Opening patent libraries, waiving royalties, pharmaceutical and biotech and medical instrumentation companies teaming up. The sequencing of the human genome and the million-fold increase in speed has allowed many things to happen. It was only 11 days after the Chinese released the DNA of the coronavirus that Moderna went into action to try to work on this vaccine. And as Tal Zaks pointed out, and all of these podcasts are available to you at the Milken Institute, at mikemilken.com, on Apple or Spotify at this time, or iHeartRadio. But as Tal Zaks, a good friend who was the chief medical officer, pointed out, they are not in competition with any other company in the world. They're in competition with this coronavirus and bringing this pandemic to an end. And it was only 63 days from the releasing of the DNA to when the first human being received the Moderna vaccine. This technology has changed the world that allows us to look at things differently. We all remember the first sequencing with my good friend Francis Collins, who worked for almost 13 years at a cost of over $3 billion and completed the effort in 2003. The interview with Francis D'Souza, the CEO of Illumina, clearly points out that today it's less than an hour and a few $100s, and the costs will probably continue to drop. When you look at these group of podcasts, one of the things we reached out to were 4 individuals who were involved with 4 of the most valuable companies in the world. Eric Schmidt, who was the CEO of Google, Steve Ballmer, who was the CEO of Microsoft, Joe Tsai, the co-founder of Alibaba, and Lady Nicola Mendelsohn, who runs Europe, Middle East, and Africa for Facebook. Obviously, none of these companies existed 30, 40 years ago to the extent today. They all bet on that element we discussed: cost, speed, storage, and access. And what did they all say? Tele-everything. These devices will be your doctor, your health advisor, your educator, your financial advisor, your bank, and quite possibly your source of all entertainment someday. They're available throughout the world. And what we have seen during this period of time that many people have spoken about, and Bob Pittman, who runs iHeart, the largest radio company in the world pointed out that we've probably accelerated technology by 3 to 5 years. As we look at finance today, it has been transformed. The most valuable financial company in the world is Visa, the second most, MasterCard, the fourth, maybe about to be the fifth, is PayPal, all digital, and Alibaba, who went public in the last week or two. Its subsidiary and financial alone, as a financial company, will be the third or fourth. The world is being digitized, and this data someday will allow us to load all of our medical data, even our blood, into some device that's then digitized and sent around the world. We have seen dramatic changes, but probably no more than in telemedicine. Many places have had more visits on telemedicine in one day in 2020 around the world than they did in 2019. The sharing of data. How was a patient treated in Italy or China, and how could that improve the way we treat coronavirus patients in Europe or the United States? In closing, I want to thank all of you for your career choices to work in this field. We often talk about what is an economic stimulus. And short-term stimulus is generally building houses, factory, roads, bridges, etc., airports. But the long-term stimulus, as I started this talk, is really the people that have chosen to work in bioscience, whether they're working for a medical instrumentation company, a hospital, care provider, biotech, pharma, whether they're in academics, government agencies, or for-profit companies. That is the long-term stimulus and what has accounted for most of the economic growth. And it isn't just lives that are longer, it's healthier lives. In closing, I'd like to read to you one of my favorite quotes from a man who changed the world of sports, Jackie Robinson. And Jackie said, "A life is not important except in the impact it has on other lives." You're working in this field that will make that short clip from bones making Chekhov well again a reality with focus ultrasound. Will change the world for not only millions of people, but billions of people, and improve not only the length, but the quality of their life. Thank you for letting me have an opportunity to visit with you today.